Devil's Invitation. Started as a drunken dare. Summon the devil, Kyle had said, slurring his words as he shoved an old, tattered book into my hands. The group laughed nervously, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from amusement but from unease. I should have walked away then, but I didn't. We were in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town, a place whispered about in local legends. The walls were crumbling, and the smell of mildew mixed with something far more putrid. The only light came from flickering candles we had placed haphazardly around the room. "Do it, Matt," Kyle taunted again, grinning through his drunken haze. What's the worst that could happen? The book felt heavy in my hands, its leather cover slick with age. The pages smelled of rot, the faded script barely legible in the dim light. I scanned the ritual, a sick feeling settling in my stomach as I read the words aloud in my head. It was nonsense, surely just a collection of superstitions. But the others were watching, waiting. "Fine," I said, forcing a laugh to mask my unease. "But if the devil shows up, I'm blaming all of you." I began the ritual. I drew the circle as instructed, using the ashes from the burnt pages of the book Kyle had carelessly tossed into the fire earlier. The air grew colder with each line I traced, though I convinced myself it was just the chill of the old basement seeping in. Then came the words, "Domini Inferni, exaudi me." My voice wavered as I spoke the strange, guttural incantation. "Louder," Kyle urged, his voice echoing eerily in the silence. I hesitated but continued. The final line required blood, my blood. With a deep breath, I pricked my finger on the jagged edge of a broken beer bottle and let a single drop fall into the center of the circle. Nothing happened. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the dying fire. "See? Told you it was fake," I said, exhaling a relieved laugh. But the air didn't feel lighter. If anything, it felt heavier. And then the shadows moved. The candles flickered violently as a chill swept through the room. I froze, my breath visible in the sudden cold. "Did you feel that?" Abby whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the circle of ashes began to smolder, a faint red glow emanating from its center. "That's enough," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm stopping this." But when I stepped toward the circle, I couldn't move. It was as if an invisible force had anchored me in place. From the center of the circle, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, a mass of darkness that seemed to consume the faint light around it. But as it took shape, my stomach churned. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured, save for two glowing red eyes that burned with an intensity that made my knees buckle. "Who dares summon me?" The voice was deep and resonant, each word vibrating through my bones. The others screamed, but I was paralyzed. I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "You called me child, and now you owe me a debt." "No," Abby said, stepping forward. "This is some kind of joke, right? Kyle, you set this up, didn't you?" Kyle didn't answer. He was frozen, his face pale as the entity turned its gaze to him. "Silence," the figure commanded, and Kyle's mouth snapped shut as if sealed by an invisible force. I could feel the air being sucked from the room, the weight of its presence pressing down on my chest. "State your wish," it said, turning back to me. "I don't have a wish," I blurted out. "This was a mistake." The entity laughed, a sound that was more like a guttural growl. "There are no mistakes, mortal. You summoned me, and a bargain must be struck." I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. "Take Kyle," I said impulsively, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The room went silent. Everyone stared at me, their eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Kyle tried to speak, but the entity silenced him again with a flick of its clawed hand. "A cowardly offer," it said, its tone dripping with disdain. "But I am not interested in him. It is you I desire." I felt my knees give way, and I collapsed to the floor. "Please," I begged. "I didn't mean to." "Enough," The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like tendrils. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was Abby's terrified face as she screamed my name. When I woke up, I was alone. The basement was empty, the candles burned out. The circle was gone, and so were my friends. At first, I thought it had been a dream, some alcohol-fueled hallucination. But when I staggered upstairs, I found the front door wide open, and outside, lying in the grass, were 3 bodies. I don't know how long I stared at them. Abby, Kyle, and Ethan. All of them lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. My hands were trembling as I dialed 911, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't tell them about the ritual or the entity that had emerged from the circle. The police arrived, and I told them the only thing I could think of. That we had been drinking, and I didn't know what had gone wrong. They didn't believe me, of course. The funerals were quiet affairs, but the stairs were not. Everyone in town looked at me with suspicion, as though they knew I was responsible. And maybe I was. I thought it was over, that I had escaped the worst of it. But then the dreams started. Every night, I see them, the glowing red eyes, the twisted form. It whispers to me, its voice coiling around my thoughts like a serpent. You owe me, Matthew. No matter how far I run, no matter how many nights I try to stay awake, I can feel it closing in. The bargain was struck, and the devil always collects. If you ever find an old book filled with strange symbols and forgotten rituals, leave it alone. No dare, no thrill is worth what comes next. The Devil's Bargain. When the clock struck midnight, the house seemed to exhale, as though it were alive. The air grew thick, carrying a subtle tang of sulfur that tickled the back of my throat. I couldn't help but shudder, clutching the small, tattered book in my hands. I had stolen it from the library's restricted section weeks ago, though I wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't my kind of thing, occult rituals, dark invocations, and forbidden ceremonies. But something about it called to me, as if the book had been waiting, whispering promises I couldn't ignore. Evelyn, the voice, soft and rasping, seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I snapped my head up, the flickering candle casting long shadows across the room. My name. I swore I had heard my name. It all began 3 nights ago. I was desperate. My mother was sick, and the doctors didn't have answers. Her health was spiraling, and the hospital bills were devouring every penny I had. I had tried everything, begged for help, but nothing worked, until I found the book. The ritual was simple, at least that's what the text claimed. Light a black candle. Draw a circle in salt. Speak the incantation. Offer a drop of blood. And the devil himself would appear, ready to grant any wish. The warnings were clear, too. Do not ask questions you cannot handle the answers to. Do not look away. And under no circumstances, do not lie. It felt like a foolish, desperate attempt, but that's exactly what I was. Desperate. I drew the circle in the center of my living room, careful not to break the line of salt. The old house creaked in protest as I moved, a draft slipping through unseen cracks. I placed the candle in the middle of the circle, its flame sputtering to life with a single strike of a match. Then, with trembling hands, I pricked my fingertip and let a bead of crimson fall onto the book's pages. The blood soaked into the paper instantly, as if the book were drinking it. I hesitated, my pulse pounding in my ears. The words on the page seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. Taking a deep breath, I began to read aloud. Domini tenebrarum, ego voco te. The words felt strange on my tongue, thick and guttural. The air in the room shifted, growing colder, heavier. The candle's flame flared, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Then, everything went still. Why have you summoned me? The voice was deep, resonant, and cold enough to make my blood freeze. I looked up, and there he was. The figure standing before me was impossible to describe fully. His face was shrouded in shadow, yet I could feel his eyes piercing me. His form flickered, shifting between a man in a dark suit and something far more grotesque. Horns curling from his head, his skin charred and cracked like smoldering embers. I need your help, I stammered, forcing myself to meet his gaze. He tilted his head, the movement unnervingly smooth. They all do. What is it you desire, child? My mother, I whispered. She's dying. I need you to save her. The devil's lips curled into a smile, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. A life saved requires a price. Evelyn, are you prepared to pay it? I swallowed hard. What's the price? He chuckled, the sound echoing in the small room. That is not how this works. I will grant your wish, and in time, I will come to collect what is owed. Do you agree? Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to blow out the candle and erase the circle. But then I thought of my mother, her frail body wasting away in that hospital bed. I thought of her hands, once strong and warm, now trembling with weakness. Yes, I said, my voice barely audible. Then it is done. He reached out, his fingers cold and sharp as they brushed my cheek. The room spun, the air growing impossibly heavy. And then he was gone. The next morning, the hospital called. She's awake, the nurse said, her voice filled with astonishment. It's a miracle. I rushed to the hospital, tears streaming down my face as I embraced my mother. She looked healthier than she had in months, her cheeks flushed with color, her smile bright and genuine. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, that the nightmare had ended. But the nightmares began that very night. They started small at first, a feeling of being watched, shadows moving just out of sight. I'd wake in the middle of the night to find the candle from the ritual burning on its own, its wax pooling in the center of the circle I had drawn. Then the voices started, soft at first, barely audible. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. They called my name, whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. By the third night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing in the corner of my room, his eyes glowing like embers. He never spoke, but his presence was suffocating. And then my mother started to change. At first, it was subtle. Her laughter sounded wrong, too sharp, too hollow. She began to speak in strange tongues, her voice echoing unnaturally. One night, I found her standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her reflection in the glass didn't match her movements. "What are you doing, Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling. She turned to me, her eyes black as coal. "He's coming, Evelyn," she said, her voice distorted. "He always collects." I stumbled back, my heart pounding as she began to laugh. A cruel, guttural sound that didn't belong to her. By the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the living room, the circle of salt still faintly visible on the floor. I lit the candle, the flame flaring to life immediately. "Devil," I called, my voice shaking. "I summon you." The air grew cold, the shadows deepening. And then he was there, his grin wider than ever. "You called, my dear? This isn't what I wanted," I screamed. "You said you'd save her." "I did," he said, his voice calm. "But life cannot be taken without consequence. Your mother's soul now belongs to me." "No!" I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "Take me instead, please." The devil chuckled, his eyes glowing brighter. "Oh, Evelyn, you were always part of the deal." Before I could react, the candle's flame exploded, plunging the room into darkness. And then I felt his hands, cold, sharp, and unrelenting, pulling me into the void. They say desperation can make you do foolish things. But no matter how desperate you are, never summon the devil. He always gets what he's owed. The Pact 2. I always thought the stories were just folklore, a collection of warnings passed down through generations. My grandmother loved to tell them. She'd sit in her old rocking chair, her frail hands knitting as she whispered tales of the devil making deals with desperate souls. "Never play with fire, Matthew," she'd say, her cloudy eyes fixed on me. "Because when the devil comes to collect, he doesn't leave witnesses." I never took her seriously. How could I? Those were just tales, cautionary fables to keep kids like me on the straight and narrow. But looking back, I wish I'd listened. It started 3 months ago, on the night I decided to test the legend for myself. I was broke, unemployed, and losing my grip on life. My girlfriend had left me 2 weeks earlier, and the eviction notice on my apartment door was the final nail in the coffin. I felt like a failure. Every plan I had for my future was falling apart, and I was desperate for a way out. That's when I remembered the stories. There was a spot just outside town, an old, abandoned church surrounded by a crumbling graveyard. It was the kind of place kids dared each other to visit on Halloween, but no one actually stayed long. They called it the Devil's Altar, claiming it was where lost souls went to make deals. I laughed at the idea at first, but desperation makes you do stupid things. That's how I found myself standing in the graveyard under a full moon, clutching a dusty old lantern I'd brought to light the way. The church was a ruin. Its walls were crumbling, and the wooden beams of its roof jutted out like jagged ribs. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and decay. There, in the center of the room, was the altar. It was a simple slab of stone, stained dark by time and weather. Graffiti covered the walls around it. Symbols and words I didn't understand, though they sent a shiver down my spine. Ryan, my old college roommate, had once joked that calling the devil was easy. Light a candle, spill a little blood, and say his name 3 times, he'd said with a laugh. I figured it wouldn't hurt to try. I lit the candle and placed it on the altar. Then, using a pocket knife, I pricked my finger, letting a single drop of blood fall onto the stone. "All right," I muttered, feeling ridiculous. "Let's see if this works." Cleared my throat. "Devil, I summon you," I said, my voice shaky. Nothing happened. "Devil, I summon you," I repeated, louder this time. The candle flickered, but I figured it was just the wind. "Devil, I summon you," I said for the 3rd time. The air in the room changed. It grew thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was being squeezed out. The flame on the candle grew taller, brighter, casting unnatural shadows across the walls. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who dares?" a voice asked, deep and resonant. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned, but the room was empty. "You called me," the voice continued, and this time it was right behind me. I spun around, and there he was. The figure standing before me was tall, impossibly so, with broad shoulders and an air of authority that made me feel like an insect beneath his gaze. He wore a suit, impeccably tailored, but his face was obscured, hidden in shadows that seemed to defy the flickering candlelight. "What is it you desire?" he asked, his voice smooth and commanding. My throat was dry, and I struggled to find the words. "I want a second chance at life. I want to fix everything." The devil tilted his head, considering me. "A simple request," he said, "but nothing comes for free. Are you prepared to pay the price?" "What's the price?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled then, a grin that revealed rows of sharp, white teeth. "You'll know in time." I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was the desperation, or maybe it was the weight of his presence, crushing me into submission. But I nodded, and he extended a hand. When I shook it, pain shot through my body, searing and white-hot. I fell to the ground, gasping for air as the room spun around me. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. At first, everything seemed normal. In fact, it was better than normal. My landlord called to tell me the eviction notice had been a mistake. My old boss offered me my job back with a raise. Even my girlfriend called, saying she wanted to give things another shot. It was as if every piece of my life had fallen perfectly into place. But then the nightmares started. Every night I dreamed of the church. I saw the devil's grin, heard his laugh echoing in the darkness. And every night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Worse, strange things started happening during the day. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision. Shadows that didn't belong. Mirrors reflected things that weren't there. Twisted figures that grinned at me before vanishing. And the voices, they started as whispers, faint and unintelligible. but they grew louder, more insistent. They called my name, told me to run, to hide. One night, I woke to find the candle from the church sitting on my bedside table. I hadn't brought it home. The flame was lit, though I hadn't touched it. And standing at the foot of my bed was the devil. "It's time," he said, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "For what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "For me to collect." I tried to run, but the room seemed to warp around me, the walls stretching and bending as if the house itself was alive. The shadows grew darker, deeper, until they swallowed everything. When I came to, I was back in the church. The altar was stained with fresh blood, my blood. The devil stood before me, his grin wider than ever. "A deal is a deal," he said. "And now your soul is mine." I screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw was his face, finally revealed. An endless void of darkness, filled with countless, screaming faces. One of them was mine. I should have listened to my grandmother. The devil doesn't leave witnesses. The Pact. I never believed in the devil. Not really. Sure, I grew up hearing stories about him, warnings from the old folks in town who loved to scare kids with their fire and brimstone sermons. But I figured they were just that, stories, tales meant to keep people in line. That changed the night I went looking for him. Started as a joke. My friends, Sam and Ryan, had been drinking, and the conversation turned, as it often did, to urban legends. We were in Sam's basement, a dimly lit space cluttered with old furniture and the stale smell of damp wood. "You ever hear about the Devil's Crossroads?" Ryan asked, leaning back in his chair with a sly grin. I rolled my eyes. "What, like from those old blues songs? You sell your soul for fame or something?" "Not fame," Ryan said, his grin widening. "Anything you want. Money, power, love. All you have to do is go to the right spot at the right time and call him." "And you believe that?" I asked, laughing. Sam shrugged. "Why not? Plenty of people claim to have seen him. And it's not like we have anything better to do tonight." That's how I found myself standing at the edge of a desolate field, the moon high and full above me. The Devil's Crossroads, as Ryan called it, was just a dirt intersection in the middle of nowhere. The air was cool, and a faint mist clung to the ground, giving the place an eerie, otherworldly feel. Ryan had given me a set of instructions, half serious, half drunk. "Midnight," he said. "You stand in the middle, light a candle, and say his name 3 times. If you've got the guts, he'll show up." I didn't believe it, not for a second. But I wasn't gonna back down and let Ryan and Sam call me a coward. So there I was, alone in the dark, with a cheap wax candle clutched in my hand. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I lit the candle, its tiny flame flickering weakly in the still air. "All right, let's get this over with," I muttered. I stepped into the middle of the crossroads, feeling the loose dirt crunch under my boots. My heart was racing, though I couldn't say why. "Devil," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing happened. "Devil," I said again, louder this time. The silence deepened, pressing in around me like a heavy weight. "Devil," I said for the 3rd time. For a moment, nothing changed. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. Of course, nothing would happen. This was stupid. And then the flame went out. The darkness was immediate and absolute, swallowing the world in an instant. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the candle. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape moving at the edge of my vision. But as it drew closer, the air grew colder, and the weight of his presence was suffocating. He was tall, impossibly tall, his frame draped in a long, dark coat. His face was obscured, but his eyes, if you could call them that, were pits of searing red light, burning with an intensity that made my knees buckle. "You called," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. You want something, he continued, taking a step closer. Speak your desire. I didn't mean to. Do not waste my time, he growled, his voice like the crackle of a fire on the verge of roaring out of control. I don't know what possessed me to answer. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the oppressive weight of his presence, pressing down on me like a vice. I want to be happy, I stammered. I want everything to work out for me. The devil chuckled, a deep, hollow sound that made my blood run cold. Simple, he said, but happiness comes at a price. I don't want to make a deal. I blurted out, panic rising in my chest. Too late, he replied, his grin widening. You called, and now you must pay. The world spun around me, the darkness closing in like a living thing. The ground beneath me seemed to vanish, and I was falling, tumbling through an endless void. When I hit the ground, I was back in my car. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. The candle was still in my hand, unlit. The dirt road stretched out before me, silent and empty. But something was wrong. Started small. My reflection in the rearview mirror seemed off. The eyes staring back at me were darker than they should have been, the pupils too large. The shadows in the corners of the car didn't behave like shadows should. They twisted and writhed, moving even when the car was still. And then there were the voices. At first, they were faint whispers just at the edge of hearing. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. They called my name, begged for help, and laughed. Deep, guttural laughs that made my skin crawl. When I finally made it home, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, as if that could keep whatever was happening at bay. But the house wasn't safe either. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me like grasping hands. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection grinned at me. I told you, it said, its voice not my own. You called me. I don't know how long it's been since that night. Days? Weeks? Time has lost all meaning. The whispers are constant now, a ceaseless chorus that fills every corner of my mind. I can't sleep, I can't eat, and I can't escape. The devil isn't done with me yet.